Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. I see lots of familiar faces, some students who have been with us all the whole time, including Yana, who's made it from Europe even in the middle of the night for all 9 now, the Return of the King classes. Some people that I haven't seen in a while, some people I just met at Mythmoot. Hi, April. Good to see you here. So anyway, what a neat group of people. For those of you who are new to our interface here, there's the questions box. That's the really important part. Type into there and hit return, and I'll be able to see it right away. So if you want to contribute to, if you have any observations on what we're talking about or want to ask further questions, then please, by all means, go ahead and do that. So tonight, what we're going to be doing is open Q&A. So I have received a bunch of questions, and I would like to go through those. I want to start with requests to discuss bits that we didn't get to. We're going to touch on at least one passage of the Two Towers and then some Return of the King business. Brandon Lovesey is complaining about my depriving him of sleep from doing 2 evening sessions in 1 week. Well, Brandon, again, just think of the poor Europeans, some of whom stayed up until 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday, or rather on Wednesday morning. Anyway, so yeah, okay, so first, actually, I don't have a slide for this one because I just got this question from Rachel Barton like an hour ago. But it's a perfectly fair request. She asked that we talk some about the Palantir, as in the Two Towers class I contrived entirely to skip the Palantir chapter. So I'll sort of make a few remarks about the Palantir. One of the things that I think is important about the Palantir as it is described there is that I don't believe that we are to understand that the Palantir is itself evil or corrupt. That is to say, keep in mind that the Palantiri are communication devices. They are primarily means by which people can communicate with each other from afar. Now, we are told, Gandalf talks about using the Palantir to see other things. We know, of course, that Denethor puts it to that kind of use, and Gandalf suggests that it can be used to see things not only remote in distance, but also remote in time. In particular, he mentions the desire to use it to look back and see the unimaginable hand and mind of Feanor at work. A line which is particularly poignant. It's one of those lines that I think of when I think back to what it must have been like. I didn't experience it myself, but what it must have been like, that is, except in my childhood, when I wasn't paying so much attention to these things, to read The Lord of the Rings without the Silmarillion. That is, when that name, Feanor, just kind of floated out there without any clear story behind it. But anyway, anyway, you can see things in it, but does it draw people? Is it corruptive? It's less... It's not really obvious to me that is necessarily the case in any kind of obvious way. When Denethor and Saruman, for both Denethor and Saruman, obviously it plays a significant role in their corruption. But with neither one of them is it actually corruptive. That is to say, the possession of the One Ring, for instance, does seem actually to corrupt you, actually to twist you morally. Again, I think of Gandalf's words when he talks about, that good intentions will not endure, when you have the One Ring. It will eat your mind away, again, to quote Gandalf about it in another thing, in another context. That is, the effect that the ring seems to have on its possessor is simply evil, and it corrupts them morally. But I don't think the Palantiri work the same way. I think that in both of the 2 cases where we see it acting corruptively, it is a means, essentially. It enables both Denethor and Saruman to pursue the desires that they already had. They are both of them corrupted both directly in direct confrontation with Saruman, and indirectly, more indirectly anyway, for Denethor, by the will of Sauron directly. That is one of the biggest problem that they have with the Palantiri, is that Sauron is on the other end of the line. This is a particular danger with Denethor, because he's looking in the stone of Minas Tirith, and the stone of Minas Tirith and the stone of Minas Ithil, we're told, are very, very closely associated with each other. So again, both of them, Sauron is using the Palantiri as a medium to reach to their minds, or rather to, in Saruman's case, draw him to reach out to his, and at which point he will trap him. So again, it's not that the Seeing Stone itself is perverting Saruman, but rather it is the medium through which Sauron gains access to Saruman's mind. Both Denethor and Saruman were already treading a crooked path when they took up the Palantir. So again, it's a means. It's not like. Again, I think it's in that way, not like a ring of power. Pippin's attraction to the stone, his curiosity, is very interesting, and I'm not 100% sure how to take that. I don't think that this is something that would affect everybody. It's obvious, for instance, that it hasn't affected everybody equally. Yes, Pippin did pick it up, but again, does it have a magic effect on him that it affects him by skin contact? Is it something that is communicable by contact with your bare skin? Had he worn gloves, would he be fine? Obviously, I think these things to me suggest that that's kind of silly. In particular, the line that always jumps out at me as being kind of ironic is, I think about the parallelism between the dumb thing Pippin does involving a stone at the end of book 3, in the middle of the Two Towers with the Palantir, and the silly thing Pippin does with the stone in book 2 in Moria when he drops the stone into the well. And that line in which Gandalf is chiding him when they hear the hammers the sound coming up out of the well after Pippin drops the stone down in Moria. When Gandalf says it may have nothing to do with Pippin's foolish stone, and that phrase, Peregrine's foolish stone, is something that that's the first time, when I got to that passage, I'm like, wait a second, he's got more than one foolish stone here, doesn't he? And in both cases, we could see that his motivations are similar. In both cases, he's drawn against his better judgment, out of curiosity, to probe the depths of something. He has kind of glimpsed over the edge of something, but wants to see more. And that desire to see more, which seems to be, in one sense, a fundamentally Tookish desire that Mr. Took has. He drops the stone into the well to find out how deep it really is, and he snatches the stone from Gandalf in order to look into it and see what he can actually see in it. Though he did get a glimpse in when he picked it up, and therefore wanted to see more. Again, that's what I attribute that to, not to some kind of addictive or some sort of magical spell that is cast on him. You notice Gandalf kind of throws cold water on that. When he says he didn't know what he was doing, and Gandalf says, "Oh yes, you did. You knew you were acting wrongly." Yeah, Brandon asks, well, if that's true, then what would Gandalf have the power to cure? His curiosity, apparently. That Gandalf say, such things can be cured, Gandalf does tell him. I don't know. I don't know what means he would have used. The burned hand teaches best, he says. What would he have done? I don't know. But it does seem to be, yeah, Arthur, you're right. He does say that Pippin never should have touched it. I think, again, I'm suspecting that doesn't have to do with, like, skin contact with it, but rather the fact that he picked it up and glanced in it. It makes me wonder to what extent Pippin might have been sort of, when he picked it up and looked into it, is he, did he have some kind of very small indirect encounter? Could he in some sense the mind of Sauron, or could the mind of Sauron sense him on the other end, to detect someone looking into the stone? Is there some kind of attraction in it in that way? Arthur, I agree with your phrase there, sort of Sauron calling to him in some sense, I think. That seems to me much more likely. Again, much more likely than this is simply a property of the stones. That seems to me much less likely and doesn't seem to fit with what we're told about them and their original appearance. So anyway, there's obviously much more that can be said about them. But I thought it only fair to say a couple things about them. But again, to me, the most important role that they play for both Denethor and Saruman is to enable them to do what they're already doing. In some ways, it's almost like it almost sort of shines a spotlight on them. I mean, Saruman was already going. It's not like the Palantir didn't make him go bad. It didn't. He already was, presumably, before he looked into it. I mean, I think that we don't know exactly when he looked into it, but it seems relatively clear that he was already going bad. So in this way, I think just the way that it gives them the capacity to pursue the ends that they have already chosen is what sort of serves as the amplifier. And so in a sense, you can say almost the same thing with Pippin. It amplifies his curiosity, the curiosity which almost led to complete disaster in Moria, and now almost leads to complete disaster again. And I get, the more I think about those scenes, the more striking I find the parallels, both in Pippin's motivation and in what he does, and the fact that he reveals their presence to the enemy, and all those things. You can see a pretty tight parallel between those two passages, which makes the first one look like a foreshadowing of the second one. Tom says a combination of Tookish curiosity and the fact that the stone is glowing with a heart of fire. Who wouldn't want to figure out a little bit more of that? Just as I can perfectly understand Pippin's desire to huck a stone down the well in Moria. I too would be really curious. Does it have a bottom? How far down does it go, really? I'd be pretty curious too. I have to say, I'd be pretty tempted to pitch a stone into that also. Ridiculous as it is under the circumstances. It's actually a scene I really didn't like in the Fellowship of the Ring film version, when he totally accidentally makes this thing, this really noisy, skeleton in armor fall into the well. Mostly because it completely lost the entire spirit of that. The whole point is his deliberate choice, his curiosity and his deliberate choice to toss the stone down the well in order to find out what's down there. Again, that's actually a really good illustration of the kind of complete shifting of the ground of scenes that they do so much less of in the Hobbit films. It's a good illustration, actually. What I like better about the Hobbit films than the Lord of the Ring films. But anyway, I digress. So again, the way that sets up the Palantir scene, I think, is very important. Okay, let me go on, because that's not even on my slides here. So let me move on to a couple passages that I didn't get a chance to talk about. April, that's a really great point. Speaking of the Hobbit movie, she's recalling Bilbo's tweaking of the spider's web. I was thinking of Pippin there too. That seemed like a very Tookish moment, a very fool of a Took moment. April, as you say. Yeah, I was totally thinking of that passage when I was watching the films there. It's almost like they're trying to make up for screwing it up with Pippin in the Fellowship of the Ring. But anyway, and interesting in that context with that at that moment him being especially Tookish. But anyway, I'm totally stopping thinking about it. Anyway, let's move on to, as I said, a couple passages that I skipped that I was really sorry to. I want to look back at Pippin and Merry's oaths that they swear. Both of them swearing to serve Denethor and Theoden, respectively. And I think that these two passages are well, they're very interesting. Of course, they're very different. Here's Pippin's oath to Denethor. Here do I swear fealty and service to Gondor, and to the Lord and Steward of the realm, to speak and to be silent, to do and to let be, to come and to go, in need or plenty, in peace or war, in living or dying, from this hour henceforth, until my Lord release me, or death take me, or the world end. So say I, Peregrine, son of Paladin, of the Shire of the Halflings. And this do I hear, Denethor, son of Ecthelion, Lord of Gondor, Steward of the High King, and I will not forget it, nor fail to reward that which is given, fealty with love, valour with honour, oath-breaking with vengeance. Then Pippin received back his sword, and put it in its sheath. One very small side thing I would say, this is actually the site of what I think is the biggest single mistake that Robert Inglis makes in his wonderful reading of The Lord of the Rings, which I love, the only unabridged audio recording of The Lord of the Rings. He does both of those peregrines in both of those paragraphs in Pippin's voice, and obviously the second one is Denethor. But anyway, that's by the by. One thing, of course, that I can't forbear to mention is the style of this. This is a gorgeous oath stylistically. Notice the pairings, right? You know, we have this structure of 2s and 3s that goes all the way through. You don't only swear service to Gondor, but to Gondor and to the Lord and Steward of the realm, right? So you've got the doubling there, and then you've got the pairs. He promises to do 3 pairs of things: to speak and to be silent, to do and to let be, my favorite pairing, to come and to go. And I don't think that's a reference to Through the Looking Glass, but it always makes me think of it when the White King says that he has 2 servants, one to come and one to go. Anyway, in need or plenty, in peace or war, in living or dying, from this hour henceforth, until my Lord release me, or death take me, or the world end. So we get the three pairs of things he promises to do in the 4 different conditions, right? In either need or plenty, peace or war, living or dying, from this hour henceforth, in the present and in the future, right? Even that last one is a pairing. And then ending with the 3 conditions which will terminate his service. My Lord release me, or death take me, or the world end. I love that. I've always loved that last one. Like, you know, we have to include that possibility that the world will end before either of the other 2 things occurs. And then Denethor's response also has focuses on the 3 there, right? But both the pairings, the groups of 2 and 3, we've got the 3 pairs. I will match. So, you know, Pippin is promising to do either of these 2 things, right? So his promise is, in this sense, sort of unconditional, right? That he promises to do all of these, you know, both to speak and to be silent, to do and to let be, to come and to go, you know, in all of these, you know, diverse, you know, pairs of opposites of circumstances. It makes it explicitly, you know, through all of these pairings and groupings, it makes it a completely unrestricted vow that he is taking. You know, I will promise to do and not do all things that I do and not do under all circumstances from now on until you release me or I die or the world ends. And Alyssa points out, I was actually thinking about that this last time through also. Alyssa says, I used to think, or the world end, very drastic, but not so much if you think about the origins of this society with the downfall of Numenor. Yeah, absolutely. And also the fact that they're living under the shadow. I think of I was thinking of this in the conversation between Faramir and Éowyn, right? When they think they're facing the end of the world right now. I mean, when Pippin takes this oath, the world could end like any time now, right? In some ways, it seems like a reflection of the very imminent sense of doom that the Gondorians have been living under, especially of late. And then, as I say, Denethor's response is not equally unconditional, right? That is to say, we don't have a reciprocal oath sworn back to Pippin, and I, that might seem like an odd thing to say. Well, of course not. Pippin is swearing to serve him. Why would the Lord swear, a reciprocal vow to him? Well, because that's how feudalism works in theory. Not that both of them swear the same vows to each other, but that it's a mutual binding to each other, and that both sides mutually have responsibilities and swear to be true to the promises they are each making to each other. They don't swear the same promises to each other, but they both swear promises to each other. Notice that the steward's half of this vow is in this sense entirely one-sided. That is, he hears the oath first of all. So he's like, ratifying it. I'm confirming the existence of this vow that you just made, and stating that I'm not going to forget it, and I'm not going to fail to reward it. That's all he promises to do: not forget, and not to fail to reward. But of course, reward is being used in a very broad sense here, right? I will not fail to give your actions their proper retribution. I will reward fealty with love, valor with honor, and oath-breaking with vengeance. Again, a very unilateral promise from Pippin, a not unilateral promise from Denethor. I will only promise to give you what you have deserved. So in this way we can see a very, not only the highly structured and formalized, and again I would say gorgeous, syntax of the oath, but again it shows you something, not only in its sort of formality, but in its content about about sort of the status of things in Gondor, the fact of the steward being mentioned in both halves, to Gondor and to the Lord and Steward of the Realm, and this do I hear, Lord of Gondor, Steward of the High King, makes one wonder, certainly makes me wonder, how old is the verbiage here in this oath. It has a sense of antiquity, certainly a sense of long formality. Doesn't sound like something Denethor's making up on the spot for Pippin to recite. But does it go back as far as the kings? Is this just a stewardly oath? I wonder. We don't have any, of course, evidence either way. But it's hard for me to imagine Aragorn making anyone swear an oath exactly like this. But it does seem to fit Denethor, I would say. April, yeah, if the king were there, you'd swear to the king. But again, I'm not even sure you'd swear to the king just like this. Or at least that his response would be just like this. It seems to me, I don't know, this seems to me a very sort of Denethorian kind of oath. Now, a couple of people have been asking about just sort of oaths in general. The Silmarillion might have taught us to be a little bit leery of oaths, which seem to not work out very well most of the time. Yes, though, I mean, of course you could even argue in this instance we have that same issue, right? That is, Pippin is swearing this oath, and he keeps it technically. Pippin is not, by the letter of the law, an oath breaker, because Denethor does release him from his service. So until my lord release me. Okay, so all bets are off. That like speaking and being silent thing no longer applies fortuitously, because, and of course even there Denethor technically said that he could go to the Grey Fool if he wanted to. So again, Pippin not technically an oathbreaker, but his actions certainly around the pyre of Denethor, not in the spirit of obedience, certainly, of Denethor's will. Beregond, of course, drawn by Pippin into explicit oath-breaking in order to do the right thing, and we talked about that a good deal when we were reading that passage earlier on in this class. But it does, I think, validate the question. Are these oaths really a very good thing? But Robert, you're right, by the way, to point out that the oath here is first to Gondor, and then to the Lord and Steward of the Realm. Though the structure of the oath makes that feel like it's a pairing. That is to say, it's not like first to Gondor and second to the Lord and Steward of the Realm. Fealty and service to Gondor and to the Lord and Steward of the Realm. Gondor and the Lord and Steward sounds to me like fealty and service, which are not synonymous. They are two different things, but it seems to me that the sense of it is that they functionally are the same thing. Yeah. Let's look, by contrast, at Merry's oath. "I have a sword," said Merry, climbing from his seat and drawing from its black sheath his small bright blade. Filled suddenly with love for this old man, he knelt on one knee and took his hand and kissed it. "May I lay the sword of Meriadoc of the Shire on your lap, Theoden King?" he cried. "Receive my service if you will." "Gladly will I take it," said the king, and laying his long old hands upon the brown hair of the hobbit, he blessed him. "Rise now, Meriadoc, esquire of Rohan, of the household of Meduseld," he said. "Take your sword and bear it unto good fortune." "As a father you shall be to me," said Merry. "For a little while," said Theoden. Now the difference in the tenderness and affection of this oath-taking is quite clear. Arthur, I think you're absolutely right to point out the significance of the motivations here. Merry is motivated by love. He is filled suddenly with love. It is a spontaneous act of love and affection for Theoden that compels his oath. In a sense, Merry is only formalizing with words something that would have been true anyway, right? It reminds me, in fact, of how Tolkien describes Pippin's reaction to Faramir, right? When he sees Faramir and realizes that this is someone that men would follow, that he would follow, and he finds himself, crying out and cheering. He doesn't have to swear any oath, right? He does the right thing by Faramir. He saves Faramir's life, not because he's sworn any oath. But again, so for Merry, at this point, whether this ceremony happens or not, Merry is going to be following Theoden. He's going to be serving Theoden. So here we have the ceremony being merely an outward formalizing of what has already happened, essentially in Merry's own heart, in Merry's own conviction. As Arthur points out, Pippin's motivation is almost the opposite. Right before Pippin swears his oath, he is stung by Denethor's words. He's moved by pride. He's irked by Denethor. Denethor has just been speaking slightingly and suspiciously of him and of the companions. So his motivations are very widely different from Merry's motivations. That's obviously, I think that's a very, very important point. Even the pretenses under which Pippin enters into this are quite different, very different from Merry's. The other thing, I can't help but think of the Anglo-Saxon poem The Wanderer here. One of the things that really marked the Anglo-Saxons, not that, of course, the ancient English have any actual cultural connection with the Rohirrim other than their language. It's completely no relation, right? So when you're thinking about the Rohirrim, don't think about the Anglo-Saxons, because there's absolutely no, remember, he said this very clearly in Appendix F. It is absolutely nothing to see here, as Scott says. As you can tell, I'm being ironic. I think that passage in Appendix F is it's a very famous passage when he forswears any kind of connection, and lists the kinds of things in which the ways in which they're not similar to the Anglo-Saxons, and of course they're the very ways in which they're quite similar to the Anglo-Saxons. I think I've explained before why I believe that Tolkien said that, because it sounds almost insincere. I mean, like, how could he possibly mean that? You know, why could he be saying that to deny something which is so obviously the case? And my explanation of that, which I'll give again, is that I think that he is basically forswearing it for sort of technical and scholarly purposes. That is to say, yes, of course the Rohirrim are just like the Anglo-Saxons, but they're not exactly like what we know for sure about the Anglo-Saxons. They are exactly like Tolkien guessed the Anglo-Saxons were. And you can look at, if you read the work of scholars like Tom Shippey in The Road to Middle-earth, if you read people like Michael Drought, they will be able to point out to you the moments where Tolkien is, through his depiction of the Rohirrim, speculating, where he is putting forward theories and opinions that he had about the Anglo-Saxons and about their culture, which he can't prove, and for which, in some cases, there's not really very much clear evidence. He could never say this in a scholarly paper because he couldn't prove it. He just kind of thought it, or guessed, or speculated, or liked to think about this. This is sort of how he, the version of them he had made into what he thought made sense, even if there's no clear evidence to prove it. So he doesn't say, so if he said, oh yeah, no, they're just like the Anglo-Saxons, he would be committing himself as a scholar now, certainly in the eyes of other scholars in the field, to saying that he really believes those things to be historically accurate. He knows he can't prove it. So he's like, no, nothing to see here, right? I officially, any connection between the Rohirrim and any other culture of the ancient British Isles is completely coincidental and in the mind of in the eyes of the beholder. Sarah, yes, exactly. He was writing Anglo-Saxon fan fiction. That's precisely what Tolkien was doing. Sure, absolutely. Yeah, the Rohirrim are one big piece of Anglo-Saxon fan fiction. Sure, why not? Yeah. But again, it's not scholarship, and Tolkien was very meticulous about that. He did not want to put things out and label them as scholarship if he couldn't prove it, if he didn't have really good evidence, much better evidence than he had. So it's just fiction, right? Just fiction, just making stuff up here. Yeah. Anyway, so that, I believe, is why he says he denies what is so manifestly true of them. So anyway, back to The Wanderer, that Anglo-Saxon poem, which, of course, does not have anything to do with Rohirrim. In that poem, one of the really striking images, one of the things that I know my own students always found most striking when I taught that poem, was the image when the Wanderer is a poem about, it's a lament from a sole survivor from his clan, from his people, who's out now wandering as an exile, and he's thinking back to his lord and to his land and to what he's lost. It's a fascinating poem. It's the same poem, of course, that the lines. We looked at the poem in the Two Towers class, Where Now the Horse and the Rider. That poem is based on a portion of The Wanderer, a much closer analysis of which is very fruitful, more close analysis, that is, than I did, closer comparison than I did in the Two Towers class. But in that same poem, the Wanderer talks about his lord, who's now dead, his king, his ring giver. And the image that's always so striking to people is that when he recalls his king, what he recalls is sitting in the hall, in the mead hall, with his king, and laying his head upon the lap of his king. That is, it's like he remembers snuggling with his king. It's these gestures of physical affection in his king's hands. It is clear that, first of all, it's very obvious from almost all of medieval literature that the medievals were much more physically demonstrative of their affection than we are. We like to think ourselves very liberated, and medievals very constrained. It was completely the opposite, as far as I can see. Friends and family members would hug and kiss much more, certainly, than we do. Mouth-to-mouth kisses were very common in families, among friends. It was something you did. Certainly something that was actually formalized. A mouth-to-mouth kiss was an explicit part of the oath of fealty in the feudal system in the Middle Ages. That's one of the things that there are a couple times in medieval lit where you'll get a male-to-male, mouth-to-mouth kiss, and modern readers are always wanting to be like, ooh, homoeroticism, and like, okay, maybe, but actually what it is an allusion to, certainly what it would have conjured up in the mind of the medieval readers is that this is a feudal moment. So when the god of love kisses the lover in the Romance of the Rose on the mouth, it's not really primarily an erotic moment at all. It is a moment of him accepting his fealty and his becoming his becoming his man. Yeah, Robert is quoting the passage where St. Paul talks about greeting all the brothers with a holy kiss in the epistles. Absolutely, that's definitely part of the thing, part of the tradition. So anyway, here I think we're getting another one of those little glimpses of Tolkien fictionally depicting a scene like that, showing the kind of affection that might have existed, that seems to have existed between lords and their servants, lords and their thanes, in the Anglo-Saxon culture. Merry doesn't go quite so far as putting his head in the lap of Theoden, right? But he does kneel before him and kiss his hand. He is physically demonstrative, right? He kisses the hand of Theoden, and then Theoden lays his hands upon his head. So it's still actually very close to that scene. Carolyn, it's a fascinating point. Carolyn points out that Denethor's part of the vow says that he'll reward fealty with love, which he clearly doesn't feel love towards Pippin. With Merry and Theoden, it is full fealty with great love. Yeah, and you notice it's like the other way around, right? Denethor says, I will reward fealty with love. If you show fealty to me, I'll give you love in return. And we might perhaps feel a bit dubious as to how fully Denethor is prepared to follow through on that particular element of the oath that Denethor, has just taken. However, Theoden doesn't reward fealty with love, right? The love comes first and the fealty comes second. The fealty is merely an expression, an overflowing of that love, which seems to be felt on both sides. Theoden is showing as much affection for Merry as Merry is showing for affection here. Now, of course, sorry, Scott, your comment is just sort of making me think here. Scott says, Denethor thinks Pippin has something to prove, and actually he kind of does. It's true. I mean, on the one hand, you can say Pippin is not only an unknown quantity for Denethor, he is in some sense a doubtful quantity because of the sort of the questionable circumstances in which he's arriving. But it's not like Theoden and Merry have a long-standing relationship, right? I mean, they've not known each other that much longer than Pippin and Denethor have. A little bit, but not much longer. I still think that
the relation that, you think about the response that Theoden has to Merry and Pippin compared to the response that Denethor has. And it's again, I think it still does clearly illustrate the difference between them. Now, Brandon makes a fascinating point. There's no explicit swearing to Theoden as a person, only to Rohan and the household of Meduseld. Notice that, and that's, I'm not sure Brandon I'd exactly say it that way. Merry is swearing to him, right? May I lay the sword of Merriotticshire on your lap, Theoden King? Receive my service if you will. From Merry, it is an entirely personal declaration. Merry doesn't say anything about serving Rohan and the household of Meduseld. When Theoden receives it, he receives it not to himself, but to Rohan and the household of Meduseld in general. Right? That is, he now places Meriadoc. Rise now, Meriadoc, Esquire of Rohan of the household of Meduseld. That is to say, I am now naming you. Right, I am explaining now what your name and position is in this realm because you have sworn. But the oath is still from Merry to him, right? Which Merry then confirms afterwards when he is when he's offering him his sword, and then afterwards, as a father you shall be to me. Yeah, and Arthur, that it is interesting. I think Brendan. I think you're onto something there, though, with that connection. And I'm thinking in similar directions to what Arthur is here. Arthur says, "For Theoden, it's not about him; it's about the realm. For Denethor, not so much." The oath that Pippin takes is much more realm-based, but to Denethor, it's personal, right? Denethor is thinking more about himself. With Theoden, the oath is personal. But he thinks but it is for Theoden sort of the gateway to Merry's inclusion in the larger realm. He now has a place and a title in Rohan. He now belongs there. And his, Theoden's being as a father to Merry makes him like all of the rest of them. He's now one of them, not necessarily in a unique position. And again, with Denethor, it's not... Pippin does not now really belong. Even though he may say he has become a man of Gondor now, right? And in a sense, that's true. Certainly not from Denethor's point of view, who still considers him and speaks of him as a spy in his very chamber. Alyssa points out, thinking about Éomer and Aragorn. Éomer says he loved Aragorn when since he first sprang out of the grass and later becomes his vassal. Is that similar? Yeah, in a sense, yes. I mean, of course, it's not... the relationship between Éomer and Aragorn, as Aragorn, sort of confirms and openly expresses in his words to Éomer after, at the end. He says, with us there can be no word of... of duty, or, we are brothers, he says. Yes, but they are brothers, one of whom is the vassal and one of whom is the liege lord. Politically, there's no question about that. But yeah, so it's not exactly the same as with Merry in the sense that his desire to swear fealty emerges, is just an outward expression of the love that he feels. But certainly the connection there with the fact that Éomer, when he re-swears, the oath of Eorl to Aragorn, he is certainly swearing that in love. And so we have that similar, not identical, but similar link there that I think is really important. Okay, lots of more good things that we could say about this, but I want to make sure I try to get on to other people's questions. But before we leave Merry and Pippin beside, I had almost forgotten about this. I meant to show this a month ago, but almost completely forgot about this. You may remember when back in the first class, I think, of the Return of the King, we were talking about Pippin and his change, the way that he is changing there, and how we see things from his perspective, and the way that Tolkien sort of shows us those things. You may recall those passages, the description of the white tree, the dead white tree, and all that. In the context of that conversation, remember, I was talking about sort of wondering about the way in which their names are used. If we can see any changes in how what percentage of the time they're referred to as Peregrine. He's referred to as Peregrine versus Pippin, or Meriadoc instead of Merry. Well, I have a chart. Thanks to Ed Powell for putting together the chart for me. Here it is. We have actual data. Ready? Okay, so let me just make sure we all understand the chart. So this is the percentage of the time. The y-axis is the percentage of the time they are referred to as Meriadoc or Peregrine, respectively. And the x-axis here is books 1 through 6 of the Lord of the Rings. Of course, book 4 is a bad data point since neither Merry nor Pippin is in or is referred to in book 4, of course, which is Frodo and Sam's trip to Mordor. So hardly surprising that data point obviously can be ignored. See, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do what all good statisticians do with their data, and that is flagrantly cherry pick it and massage it until it looks like I want it to look like. So step 1 is to ignore book 4 here entirely. And when we do that, we see with Pippin, the main difference in the percentages, I think, that to me the most interesting thing is the difference between book 3 and book 5. I'm not quite sure what to do with book 2 there. That's some kind of uncertain data there. But I think it is interesting to, again, if we ignore book 5 and book 4, in which he doesn't feature at all, we do get this upward line, which does kind of confirm what I was thinking about Pippin anyway. Increasing. Again, I have no explanation for book 2. I'll have to think about that a little bit more. Oh no! Wait, I remember what we can do with book 2. With book 2, we can. I'm kind of going to put some. We need some error bars around the book 2 because the sample size is much smaller. If I recall Ed's raw data accurately, the overall number of instances of the names is much smaller in book 2 compared to book 3 and book 5, or book 1. So, therefore, the percentage, when you're looking at a percentage of a much smaller sample size, it's a much less meaningful piece of data. So, so the one that doesn't fit into my theory, it's a little questionable, I have to say. I think we can kind of take the book 2 point with a grain of salt. Merry, I don't know what to do about. The very low percentage of Meriadoc used in book 6 I find actually kind of puzzling, since of all of them, Merry is the one who I think grows up most dramatically. Merry becomes, takes a strong leadership position, especially during the Scouring of the Shire and his return, and yet even in the whole context of that passage, even in the Scouring of the Shire, he's still very consistently called Merry. But anyway, yeah. Gene Sullivan says we should take into account how many of the book 2 data are Gandalf saying Peregrine in exasperation. That should account for most of book 2. Yes, perhaps the Gandalf exasperation factor combined with the small sample size gives this artificial inflation to the Peregrine rate, to the Peregrine percentage there in book 2. Nothing could be more likely, I think. Good. Sparrow had just said exactly the same thing, that book 2 includes a lot of Gandalf yelling at him. Yes. And Peregrine is much better to yell at someone. Yeah, I agree. Ed is pointing out Sparrow that he has outsparrowed Sparrow here in the line graph, and Ed in turn, Sparrow had just said that she wanted to make sure that I pass along how much she loves your line graphs here. So yes, there's certainly more ways I think that we can filter this data in order to make it look more like I want it to look. I think we can still work on that. Yeah, Scott thinks that we could factor in how many times the name is used in a sentence that ends with an exclamation point. That we kind of factor that in. I think so. Yeah, Peregrine is very much more. I agree. Satisfying thing to yell at somebody than Pippin, which is a very important factor, of course. Something which should always be taken into account when you name your children. I know that I did. I found that the 3-syllable first name followed by a monosyllabic middle name is a very effective cadence for discipline. So that's definitely something I have to take into account. My first son is Nicholas John. I see it's excellent. It works so well for disciplinary purposes. The cadence has to be right. But anyway, so that's the chart. As I said, the Mary data I find much more difficult. You've got the huge spike of Mariotics. I'm not quite sure what explains the Mariotic spike in Book 5. I mean, maybe his interaction with the Rohirrim. But Tom is pointing out that my son's first and middle names have the same cadence as Fool of a Took. Coincidence? We'll see. But yeah, I would think that if anything explains the Mariotic spike in Book 5, it would be the Rohirrim factor. That we get him interacting more with the Rohirrim, even just him being spoken of in context with the Rohirrim, seems that it would correlate with that word, with that more often. Yeah. Anyway, and see, that's the kind of thing actually that I would kind of expect to be significant. That it's exactly, thinking back to the appendices, thinking back to Appendix E and F. That's exactly the kind of thing that Tolkien is talking about. That when he is writing in modern English, not when he's giving the Anglo-Saxon of the Rohirric language, but rather when he is giving the modern English, he is reminding us that throughout, from beginning to end of the Lord of the Rings, it's a translation. It's an artificial thing. It's a translation into modern English from a different language. And so when he is translating he's translating often multiple languages and multiple dialects into the same thing, into modern English. And so he does reflect those things in some ways, in different ways, in different places. This is why he uses very different diction and different word choice with the Rohirrim than he does with others, because he is trying to stay true to the flavor of their language, even through, as a good translator would. So anyway, that's why I would suspect that the correlation with Rohan could perhaps produce that kind of thing. But anyway, so thanks, Ed, again for and of course I'm not at all doing justice to the efficiency of Ed's work here. With it less than 15 minutes after the end of the class in which I said we should look at this data, it would be interesting to see a chart, he'd sent me a chart. So I again, thank you, Ed, for the data here. Okay. Good. All right. Let me move on to the next question. Okay, Michael Lucero asks, I was wondering if you could talk about the lines at the very end of Homeward Bound where Merry says, "It seems almost like a dream that has slowly faded," but Frodo says, "Not to me. To me it feels more like falling asleep again." I've always felt the same way after putting the book down at the end, going back to real life after such a rich and meaningful reading experience, and I wonder what Tolkien was trying to say with these lines. Those are really rich lines, Michael, and I certainly don't know that I can do justice to what Tolkien was trying to say with these lines, but I can at least say some things that they make me think of. First, I think that Michael is very right to remind us of kind of the parallel with the reading experience, that sort of imaginative investment in the fantasy world that Tolkien describes and talks about in On Fairy Stories is, I think, something which is paralleled with the adventures in his books from the beginning. We see it with Bilbo in There and Back Again, the way in which we as readers go along with Bilbo, and just as we begin in our world, invest ourselves in the book, and then re-emerge to our world at the end, Bilbo's own career follows that same pattern, even to the extent of having him return to his mundane world at the end, but to have his mundane world enriched and changed, and his own relationship by it altered for the better, by the experience that he has had in that other world of adventure. So too we can find our own relationship and experience of the real mundane primary world around us enriched and changed by our experience in the fantasy world. So I think that parallel is perfectly legitimate. The interesting thing here is the discrepancy between Merry and Frodo's two different experiences here. One other thing that I will point to before I try to come back and answer this, and sort of how we're to understand the difference there in their experience. Within the context of The Lord of the Rings, we do have some precedents for thinking. There's this dreaming language doesn't come absolutely out of nowhere. We've had a bunch of dreams. There were dreams in The Hobbit. Remember Bilbo's dream of Bag End in the Eagle's Eyrie. And his dream also, his semi-prophetic, semi-waking consciousness dream in the Goblin Tunnels. That is, when in the Goblin Tunnels, he has like a prophetic dream of what's actually happening in the waking world around him, that the crack opens in the walls. Anyway, we also, of course, in the Lord of the Rings, Frodo is the dreamer. He dreams several times in the Lord of the Rings, especially back in the Fellowship of the Ring. Remember his dream in the House of Tom Bombadil. So he dreams of the tower in the sea. He dreams of Gandalf in Orthanc. He has visions also, of course, in the Mirror of Galadriel, which are not exactly the same as dreams, but though there seems to me, anyway, to be some similarity in the descriptions of them and sort of the things that they show and the ways that they point. So, again, we should be recalling the actual instances of dreaming that we've seen in order to perhaps help us to understand this a little bit more. Now, one other thing then that I would say about this difference. Frodo says, it doesn't feel like a dream that's fading. To me, it feels like falling asleep again. Now, remember, what they're talking about is this crossing of frontiers, right? Like with Bilbo, they too are going back again. Remember, Frodo at the beginning said that he doesn't think his story is going to be like Bilbo's. This is no there and back again journey that he's going on. He's going to go there and never come back again as far as he can see. Well, he does come back again. Right? Turns out his forebodings in the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring are unfounded. His journey is also a there and back again journey. Sort of. Right? What he finds, unlike Bilbo, is that he never can go back again. You may remember, if you've read my Hobbit book, which I don't assume, but if you have read it, you may remember that's my reading of Bilbo's song when Bilbo sings the Roads Go Ever, Ever On song at the end of The Hobbit. Is one of the things that I see going on in that poem is Bilbo being anxious, Bilbo being uncertain. Can you really go home? Are things going to be the same again? Can you go back? What happens when feet that wandered, when that wandering have gone, turn at last to home afar? What happens when the eyes that have seen fire and horror in the halls of stone look again on meadows green, and fields and streams they once have known? Then what? Right? it's right before he gets home. It's just before he returns to the hill that he sings that and sort of asks those questions, which aren't answered in the poem. Right? I mean, it's kind of an open-ended poem the way that Bilbo sings it. Well, for Bilbo, he was okay. Right? He was changed, lost his respectability, but he can go home. Frodo can't go home. For Frodo, there's no returning. For him, now coming back is not an awakening. It's falling asleep again. What is real? What is more real? And what is less real? Think of Sam also and his belonging, right? He belongs in the Shire. He is supposed to be, he's supposed to be whole. Frodo tells him, right? He belongs there. Think of Sam's own words about, how the elves belong in Lothlorien even more than elves than hobbits belong in the Shire. But Frodo doesn't belong there anymore. It's not his place anymore. He has given it up. He's lost it. He's sacrificed it so that others could have it. For him, it feels like falling asleep again. I'm reminded also of Bilbo nodding off in sleep in Rivendell. Frodo's kind of like that now, living in a different place. The other connection that I can't help but make here, when Frodo's talking about this, is to what Gandalf calls the other side. When in his conversation with Frodo in chapter 1 of book 2, when Frodo awakes after the fords of Bruinen, and he's talking about Frodo nearly going into the Wraith world. That's where we get all that stuff about the physical world and the spirit world, the Wraith world, into which Frodo had almost been drawn by the power of the wound and by the sliver of the knife left in the wound, and he was recalled. And to the world of dreams that are not quite dreams, that the place where Aragorn goes to fetch Faramir back, which is rather oddly described. And then again, Frodo is almost he's almost gone over. He's pretty darn close to Wraithdom by the end, when he claims the ring and makes it, and it turns him invisible. Remember, Gandalf comments on this back in chapter 1 of book 2, when he says that he may become like a light, right? Like glass with, he might become emptied himself. He might just become a vessel. His own self might become almost transparent. That's what he's been through. That's what he's gone through. And there's not so much of him left. Merry and Pippin and Sam can leave the high things and this world of adventure and go back to their solid, their solid hobbit lives in the Shire. Frodo can't. He can't leave it behind because he's not entirely there anymore. There's a sense in which, as Gandalf warned Frodo could happen with possession of the ring, that you become in the end invisible permanently. Frodo hasn't become invisible permanently, but it's like part of him, like part of him can. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Sarah, I think you're right to point out his phrasing, falling asleep again, makes it seem as though Frodo thought his previous life in the Shire was also a dream. Sarah, or almost more like that's how it seems to him now, right? Think of his words on Mount Doom, that how he can't remember these, when Sam is asking if he can remember these things from the Shire, and Frodo says, well, no, Sam, I can't, right? I know these things are, but I can't remember them. Again, it's another sense in which he's lost them. and another sense in which, by the way, another moment in which I think the Lord of the Rings films didn't get it right. It's kind of moving in the film when Frodo, after he's gotten his finger bit off, can remember strawberries in the Shire and all those things. But that's not how it is in the book. He's lost them. And not that he's permanently lost strawberries, but you see what I mean? Like, there are parts of him that can't be healed. He's lost parts of himself and doesn't get them back. That seems to be part of the issue, I think. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just scanning through your comments here. Let's see. Let me actually... I'm going to jump ahead, because it's related to this, to another question, which I unaccountably was shuffling around the order of my slides and I totally messed them up. But it's a very short question, so I'll just say it. Diego was asking for comparison of the endings of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and how the end of the journey, how at the end of both journeys we have a usurped home. Bilbo comes back to the auction, and Frodo comes back to find Bag End, which he himself sold, so it's not technically usurped, but of course it's been usurped by Saruman. So we do kind of see that, and as Alyssa was just reminding me, these things, Diego calls them usurped homes. Alyssa calls them pilfered homes, which I also quite like. In both cases, Alyssa said it speaks to the, sort of symbolically, to the anxiety and to that question, is it possible to return? Will your home be there? Or will it really be your home? Will it have been... will it really have been... would still be yours. Again, with Bilbo, we get a very mild version of that, right? It's still his home, it's just the stuff's been sold, right? So all of his things, he's got to try to reclaim all of his possessions, not all of which he gets back, and some of which he has to buy back. It's still his home, but all those familiar things that he's been longing for are being sold off. Here, in the Lord of the Rings, the difference is much more drastic, right? You turn home and you find Mordor, even there. This is Mordor, one of its works. So we see, Neil, as Neil says, it's a larger scale takeover here. Not only Bag End, but the Shire, and not only Bag End a little bit, but Bag End much more drastically, and damaged much more horribly, and much more permanently, though not completely permanently. Yeah, good. As Sharon has just said, the whole Shire has been usurped. Exactly. So it does seem to be broadened in that sense. But again, I think with Bag End, we see Frodo's own struggle, his own situation, sort of made physical, right? Bag End can be restored, and the Shire can be restored, but it's not exactly the same, right? It is blessed, and through Sam's forestry work, it's really lovely. But it's also different. We see the Shire being enriched, right? The difference with the Shire, I think, through Sam's efforts and through the blessings of Galadriel, we see, in the Gaffer's words, all's well as ends better. But with Frodo, that image of Bag End destroyed is is really poignant. And for him, the restoration is falling back to sleep again, right? Yeah. Yeah, Alyssa is making a really interesting connection. I won't go into too much detail on it because it involves a text which we haven't studied or read here. That is the poem, "The Sea Bell," that is in the collection, "The Adventures of Tom Bombadil," that was published in that collection later in Tolkien's life. It's tagged Frodo's Dream in that collection. In that collection of poems, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, what Tolkien was doing was mostly taking poems that he had written earlier in his life, often much earlier, like 4 decades earlier, and revising them largely, and including them in this collection. Several of them are poems which were in The Lord of the Rings. So we get the Man in the Moon poem, we get the Oliphant poem, we get the Troll song. Though, again, all 3 of those are based on poems that Tolkien had written much earlier on in his life. But he puts a Middle-earth frame in all of these things. So that is, he suggests that some of these poems we can find are written by, some are written by Bilbo, and some are by Sam, and some are by Frodo. So he gives a kind of, Middle-earth origin story for the different poems. In his introduction, he talks about this in his introduction to The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. Frodo's Dream is a tag attached to the Sea Bell, and thinking of distancing and alienation, you can see why he did it. The Sea Bell, again, that poem long predates, if I'm recalling correctly, it long predates The Lord of the Rings. So I don't think it actually comes from that. However, it certainly is a very interesting commentary upon this passage, upon Frodo's return, that Tolkien connects that return with the Sea Bell. If you get a chance, if you don't have a copy of The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, you should totally get one. The Tolkien Reader is what I recommend, is the easiest, most accessible place to get those poems. Get the Tolkien Reader, read the Sea Bell, and see what you think. It's quite a striking poem. Very different kind of trip to Fairy than Frodo in the end gets. His much more pleasant and healing trip. But it's getting late, and I should move on. Okay, Yana was asking about Ents and Elves. They were known to the Eldar in ancient days, that is, the Ents. And to the Eldar, indeed, the Ents ascribed not their own language, but the desire for speech. Might that mean that when Treebeard talks about the elves starting it, he means communication, and not necessarily making them walk and be sentient? Yana, that's how I've always understood that passage. This is, of course, Yana's referring back to the debate, which, Tolkien fans will debate how exactly did Ents come about. There seem to be 2 conflicting stories. Treebeard, in Book 3, says that the elves began it. They went around waking up the trees and teaching them all to talk. That is, the ones that they woke up, which seems to be at odds with the story from the Silmarillion about Aule and Yavanna. I have never been deeply impressed by the so-called contradiction of those 2 stories. I actually don't see any problem with the story unfolding in a way such that both of those things could easily be true. That is to say, Yavanna can very well have designed them and devised them, and the elves be the instrument of their awakening. Nothing would seem to me more fitting with the kind of delegations during the creation and subcreation process that we see all the way down the line in the Ainulindale and the Silmarillion. So I've never had a particularly big problem with that. But Yana, more specifically, I do agree with you. This is kind of how I have always understood Treebeard there. And I think, in particular, the fact that that's what Treebeard goes on to emphasize. They always wanted to talk to everything, the old elves, right? And when he refers to his gratitude to the elves, he says they cured us of dumbness, and that was a great gift, right? He doesn't say they cured us of, non-sentience. So anyway, exactly. Scott, the Quindi are the people who speak, the talking people. It has always made yes, Yana, dumbness as in muteness, not dumbness as in stupidity. Yes, dumbness as in muteness, absolutely. So they cured us of dumbness. They enabled us to talk. They taught us to speak. So yes, I do. That's how I've always understood that this comment in the appendix is perhaps designed to clarify that passage from the Two Towers. Okay, very broad question, an excellent question that Noam Weiss has asked. If you'd like to talk about the tension between the aspects of losing oneself in the story versus the more removed point of view of The Lord of the Rings as a historical narrative, there are a few times that I feel the two are in conflict. In particular, whenever a character improvises on the spot a song that is clearly tailored to the situation, and whenever a character has a prophetic moment, which makes me think that this is something that was edited in. Yes, I can definitely see the conflict. So let me just sort of back up a second and make sure that the terms of the question are clear. The issue here is about the relation between how do we understand the Lord of the Rings? How do we receive this as a text? Okay, is this supposed to be the spontaneous? The dialogue that we get. Is this supposed to be a faithful recording of the spontaneous dialogue? What these people actually said at the time when we're reading the book? Are we in the moment with these characters, or not? Or are we reading something which is not even secondhand, but third, fourth, fifth, sixth hand? A distant chronicle of what was actually happening. The answer is the second. I mean, that's what we're told we're getting. And part of me wants to say, if we read it and have a problem with the fact that we're reading something which is an ancient chronicle and very far chronologically removed from the events, that's something which on Twitter I would give the hashtag modern people problems, right? That is to say, in the Middle Ages, that's what books were, right? That's what history was called. That is the idea of sort of the immediacy, and I talked about this a little bit in the last class. The fictional frame that the majority of modern novels use is a completely artificial construct. That is to say, it asks us to invest ourselves imaginatively into something that couldn't possibly happen. That somehow the spontaneous utterances, not to mention the internal thought processes of the people involved in the story, that we're somehow just there, that we're enabled to see it. In fact, that we're enabled to see it like we're watching it on TV. And frankly, I think that TV and film have had a huge impact on this convention in fiction. Pre-TV and pre-movies, it's not that this was never known, but it was, I think, a good deal less common. That is, we don't have that sense, because again, TV has taught us to sort of consume narratives as if we just sort of have this, like you're watching a sitcom, and most of the time you are supposed to imagine that you are somehow just peering in through a transparent wall into these people's unrealistically opulent New York apartment, and just seeing and overhearing the things that are going on. The mechanism you're not supposed to ask. Of course, there are some shows that will play with this, right, and the mechanism will actually be part of the story, but that's very uncommon in TV. Books have tended to follow in that same dimension. Again, it's not that this was a 20th century invention. There certainly are a lot of 19th century novels which seem to operate in a similar kind of way, which do not have a sort of a fictional construction of how this narrative has come down to us. But it was not the sort of only assumption. It was not really the default assumption. We still got things like the epistolary novel, the novel of letters and diaries, like Dracula, or Jane Eyre, or Pamela. So anyway, like I said, if I think to one extent, if we asked Tolkien this and we said, gosh, I have to admit, if I think about the whole Lord of the Rings as something which is just hearsay, as to think that, the real Pippin didn't actually say the things that Pippin said, but rather this is just what legends have said that Pippin said. Gosh, that really kind of, that really distances me from the story, and that really makes the whole experience really suffer. I'm not sure Tolkien would have all that much sympathy for that necessarily, because again, that's the world he lived in. Was the world in which that kind of distance, was a fact of life. Was just sort of assumed. So yes, it was. As Tom was just saying, even in ancient histories, it was a convention for the historian to insert speeches that were invented, and everybody knew that and accepted it. Now, of course, a good historian tries to capture something that the historian would call a true account of that, right? But the concept of what was a true account was different for ancient and medieval historians than for modern historians. They were not just trying to say only the things that they knew were actually said, or the things that they knew actually occurred in exactly as they occurred, but would try to convey to the reader the sense of what they believed it would have been like. This is why, by the way, I get kind of frustrated sometimes by medieval historians who complain about the inaccuracy of numbers, especially the numbers of combatants in battles as they're described in medieval histories. You get a lot of modern historians who just get all snooty about this, and they're like, well, it goes without saying that medieval historians are completely unreliable when it comes to the numbers of combatants. To which I respond, well, it depends on what you mean by unreliable, right? Inaccurate in the sense that were not in fact precisely or even anything close to that number. Yes, inaccurate in that sense, but I believe the medieval historian would argue accurate in a more significant sense. That is to say, the historian was not trying to claim, I have performed research and know that there were in fact this many human beings on that field at that time, but rather the numbers that I have described them convey to you what went on in that battle. The English might not have been outnumbered quite as much as I said in my description of the Battle of Poitiers, but you know what? My description more accurately captures what that battle meant and what happened on that day than a perfectly accurate description of the battle, what a modern historian would call a perfectly accurate description. The point is, that kind of interpolation was normal, was accepted. That's part of what it meant to be a historian, not just somebody who is recording facts. But anyway, yeah, Scott, as you pointed out, this is what we were talking about last time. There are multiple places where we are told that this story is coming down to us through multiple generations of manuscript transmission and revision. So we do have to, if we choose to think about it, we don't always have to think about it, but if we choose to think about it, we do have to think that, that doesn't necessarily mean... So, moments such as Eomer's poetry on the battlefield, right? When he, out of doubt, out of dark, to the day's rising, I came singing in the sun, sword unsheathing. Did in fact Éomer compose poetry to that effect at the time? Like, had we been there at the Battle of Pelennor Field, would we have heard him utter those staves? Not necessarily. I don't think that we necessarily have to think that. But I don't think it takes anything away. Again, the fact that we like the idea of Éomer composing those is on one level just as much as to say we think the storyteller, the historian in this case, did a great job of capturing that. However, the one thing to the second point that Noah makes there, I don't think prophetic moments have to be understood in that way. That is to say that the moments of so-called prophecy or foretellings that Aragorn gives a couple times are merely the product of backwards revision of that kind. Of course, it's always easier to attribute prophetic foretellings to things after the fact, right? That's no doubt true, but I don't think that the fact that these things are being transmitted to us afterwards need strip the story of the marvel element there in the foretelling, that there it can still be a genuine predicting, a record of a genuine predicting. The part of the story that says Aragorn has occasional foretellings, may be a faithful element of the story. I don't think that it is necessarily cause for debunking. Okay. You know what? I'm not going to tell you how many slides I have. Right, Brandon, or Frodo describing Sam's children. I agree. It's another example. All right. But anyway, I'm going to go on to slide number 7 out of a certain number. Okay. Why can Gandalf vanquish despair and bring hope to Theoden, but not to Denethor? Gandalf was given Narya by Círdan to rekindle hearts in a world that grows chill. Theoden has lost a son and given in to despair. It does not take Gandalf long to rekindle his heart. Denethor has lost a son and given in to despair. Why cannot Gandalf rekindle his heart? Sauron via the Palantir is better at despair inducement than Saruman via Wormtongue? Denethor is more powerful than Theoden and better able to resist Gandalf with glances like blades flickering from eye to eye as they fenced? Denethor combines despair with the sin of pride, and that is harder to overcome? Yeah, this is a great question by Mark, made the more great by the fact that he then proceeds to go on and suggest some excellent answers to this question. Of the three theories that Mark puts forward at the end there, I think that... Oh, and Mark's here tonight. Excellent. Good question, Mark, and excellent theories. The Sauron thing is significant, I think, but I wouldn't put the majority. I wouldn't lay the majority of the stress there. I think it is. I think it is true. Denethor is more powerful than Theoden. Denethor is greater, and so therefore has the greater potential for fall. We see this lots of times, right? How many times from the Silmarillion forward do we see that the one who is greater and more powerful is the one who tends to fall from Morgoth on down, right? From Morgoth to Feanor to all the way through. The one who is at the top of the heap is the one who is most likely to tumble all the way down. You can see a similar thing in Dr. Seuss's Yertle the Turtle. But anyway, Denethor, and I think that Mark particularly touches on the thing that I would point to as most significant. Denethor resists Gandalf, right? Denethor is not buying what Gandalf is selling, and I don't think that Gandalf is going to, or even perhaps can, heal somebody against his will, right? Denethor's defenses are up. Theoden's do not seem to be. Theoden is more humble than Denethor, and I think that's why he accepts. He is very quick to say, it's not so dark, is it? If only Denethor had said it's not so dark, right? But no, he was pretty convinced of how dark it was, right? And wasn't going to listen to anything else. And that, of course, is also where the pride then comes in. Despair with pride is almost impregnable. A more humble despair is more easily overcome. Robert says, but it was dark. Yes, but it wasn't as dark as as even Denethor thought it was. It's not that it wasn't dark, but it wasn't nearly so dark. Again, as we can immediately see in the irony of Denethor's observation, and even now, the wind of thy hope cheats thee, and blows up from the south, a fleet with black sails. The horrible irony of the fact that he is pointing to the eucatastrophe as evidence in support of his despair. Anyway, look at how efficient I am. Whoa, not as efficient as that. Okay, sorry. Gandalf calls himself a steward, which in my understanding is a person that rules instead and in the name of someone else. Would this be Manwë, or the Valar in general, or Eru? I know there's not much of a difference, but I always found Gandalf's identification as a steward very interesting. Yes, Yana, I agree. I think that we're not necessarily... because you're right. On the one hand, the statement, I am also a steward, does raise the logical question, whose steward are you, actually? If you are this, if you are the one who has been given delegated authority by the ruling power, which authority are we talking about? I do think Manwë is the one in question. It is presumably Manwë who sent him back when he died. But I don't think that is necessarily the only way to think about this. I don't think that Steward of Manwë is Gandalf's job description when he comes back to Middle-earth. Exactly. That is not in a political sense. It's not like Manwë is... because with the sending of the wizards, and more particularly with Gandalf's description and his role, the hope and healing thing we were just talking about, his job description, if Gandalf had a business card, it wouldn't be Steward of Manwë, right? I mean, it wouldn't be, hi, I'm the delegated authority, Manwë's not here right now, he couldn't be bothered, he's over in Valinor, so I'm taking over Middle-earth as his steward until Manwë comes back. Again, that would be a strict parallel between Gandalf as steward and Denethor as steward, right? But I think clearly that's not the case. I mean, I think that's certainly not the position that he is claiming for himself, or even the position that he has. Not even like he's just being humble. That's clearly not the position he has. The wizards were sent not to rule, but to advise. More, I take when he says, for I also am a steward. It is, Yana, as Yana is saying now, not in his question there, a show of humility. Yes, in the sense that he's not, he's not claiming the rule of any nation. But, I think of, when Gandalf is giving that speech, he talks about, all of the good things in the world, all things that, that grow and may blossom. These things are his care, right? Gandalf being he's a steward, not in the sense that he's been given delegated authority, like the stewards of Gondor, but rather he is a steward in the sense of he is the one who is the caretaker. He's the one whose job it is to take care of things. That is, I think, the sense in which he's talking about being a steward, which was presumably the sense of what the term steward meant when the stewards were just stewards before they became ruling stewards. In a sense, ruling steward is like is almost not quite a paradox. It's again, steward isn't a synonym for servant, but a steward is a servant. And so the ruling stewards, that phrase is slightly paradoxical. And I think deliberately so. That is, I think it's not a sort of an issue of the stewards getting above themselves or doing something sort of morally dodgy, but rather I think that Mardel the steward knew full well how paradoxical his position was, and that there's a kind of self-consciousness in the irony of the line of ruling stewards. Rachel says Sam could kind of be called the steward of the Shire. Absolutely, I think that Sam could be called the steward of the Shire. I think that the role that Sam plays in the Shire at the end is a very stewardly role. That how Sam acts towards the Shire is very much parallel to the role that Gandalf is ascribing to himself in that speech. Rachel, I think that's a brilliant way to think about it. And to understand what Gandalf means when he calls himself a steward. He is a servant, a caretaker, the one who is... of course, the steward was in a position put in a position of authority in a sense, but only because a great many things are placed in his care. Your steward is like the guy who keeps your accounts, not just your bookkeeper, but is the guy that you trust to run your farm for you. The guy who takes care of administrative all the administrative details. That's again traditionally what the job of steward was. If you have numerous estates and your estates consist of farms with tenants in various places, you can't oversee them all personally, so you appoint a steward to oversee each one of them. So that steward is, on the one hand, in a position of delegated authority, but his position is not primarily marked as one who rules. It's one who serves and who oversees, who takes care of that farm, that estate, in the place of the absent master, even in the place of a present master. So that's sort of the concept. That's sort of the concept of steward. Again, in this sense, the Gondorian stewardship is weird, is deviant. It's unnatural. And of course it's unnatural because it's supposed to be a kingship, right? And so the ruling stewards are a paradox. I mean, if ruling steward sounds like a fish out of water, it's supposed to, right? Because that's not how things were supposed to be. It is a violation of the natural order. Anyway, so that's in general how I understand Gandalf's reference to stewardship. A short question with a short, simple answer. K. Ben Abraham asks, does Frodo give in and fail at the end? Yes. Okay. Next. Okay, I'm just kidding. I'll say a little bit more about that. But yes, he does. I actually, and I forget, if anybody can remember and remind me, that would be helpful. Tolkien talks about this very explicitly in at least one of the published letters. If anybody has that volume at hand and can easily look it up while I'm talking and help me refer people to the letter in question, I would be grateful. But anyway, Tolkien fails. Frodo fails. Tolkien says that Frodo fails. It's getting late and my tongue is getting twisted. At the end, meaning I assume Kay is referring to at the crack of doom, when Frodo claims the ring for himself. And that is a failure. My understanding of the failure there, Frodo needs help. Frodo does not have the strength to do it. Frodo fails, but he's not a failure. He has done everything and more than everything that could possibly have been asked of him. He has borne the ring and forborne the ring until the very, very end. But he does not have the strength to throw the ring into the fire. He didn't have the strength to throw the ring into his cooking fire, back, into his fireplace, back in Bag End, way back before all of this stuff happens. And that's a pretty clear foreshadowing of his failure to cast the ring into the cracks of doom at the end. Arthur points out, his original task was to bring the ring to the cracks of doom. He accomplished that. Yes, yeah, true. I mean, clearly, the goal was to get rid of the ring once he got there. That was clearly his task. Good. Alyssa and Tom in the same moment found it. Letter 246. Thank you. So I commend to you Letter 246, Tolkien's discussion of Frodo's failure here. But again, the thing is, I think, it's fascinating because Tolkien is credited rightly with writing a book about heroes, a book that is full of really powerful archetypes, that we get. And it's one of my complaints about the Lord of the Rings films, that those heroes are dragged down to a merely mortal level, and we get the Aragorn, fraught with self-doubt, and Gandalf, who has his staff utterly inexplicably smashed by the Witch King, which I still find to be the most inexplicable and bizarre moment in any Peter Jackson film. However, great heroes, right? In Tolkien's book, we get all these figures which are absolutely way larger than life. And yet, at the core, the very heart, the most triumphant moment in the story can't be done by a hero. Frodo doesn't simply become larger than life. In the end, he only succeeds by grace. He needs help. He needs a eucatastrophe before he can actually succeed. Steve asks the excellent follow-up question, Gandalf having seen Frodo's reluctance even to put the ring into the fireplace, how could he have trusted him to throw the ring into the fire at the council that settled on the planned course of action? Seems pretty dumb, doesn't it? I mean, come on, Gandalf. Obviously you could have seen that coming, right? It's not going to be any easier to throw it into the cracks of doom than it was to throw it into the fireplace, and he already failed at that, so how on earth could you expect him to do that? I don't think he could. Remember Gandalf's own argument on a different subject, right? Why, according to Gandalf, should they take Merry and Pippin along? Because it's the foolish thing to do, right? We should choose rather their friendship than any great wisdom, right? We've got wisdom on the one hand and foolishness on the other hand. Let's go with foolishness every time. And in the course of the Two Towers class, we talked a lot about this. This whole decision-making process thing. Choosing the outwardly foolish path is often the way to go. It's pretty clear that neither Elrond nor Gandalf is looking at Frodo and thinking, this guy's got the tools, right? This guy's got what it takes. If anybody can throw it into the cracks of doom, he can. Elrond says, if you will succeed in this quest if anybody does. That doesn't mean because you're awesome, right? Because you have, the internal fortitude to get this done. You are uniquely qualified to succeed at this. No. But he's the one who has been chosen for this, and therefore he's the one that should do it. There is an element, I think, a strong element in both Gandalf's statements and Elrond's statements, a strong element of faith. I think, and again, I talked about, I'm appealing back to my terms that I was using in the Two Towers class, especially. Good. Richard Cobb was just pointing out, perhaps Gandalf explained that in speaking of Frodo being meant to possess it. Yes, exactly, Richard. That's exactly what I'm thinking there. And remember, Gandalf says at the time, and that may be that you also were meant to have it, and that may be a comforting thought. And Frodo says, it is not a comforting thought. Well, it seems to be for Gandalf, and probably for Elrond also. But again, that's Frodo is the instrument who is used through his choices. He's the one who brings the ring there. He is the one indeed who is, it was his doom, as Frodo himself comes to accept in the Return of the King. It was his doom to go to that mountain yonder, and he does go to that mountain yonder. But in the end, he fails. He doesn't have the strength to do it himself. He needs a eucatastrophe. He needs grace. Okay. Why does Gandalf claim that the whole point of the story was to equip the hobbits to clear up the problems in the Shire? Kay pointing to Gandalf's rather sweeping statement that this is what they've been trained for. That this is the whole point of the thing. Of course, I don't think that we need to take Gandalf's comments perfectly literally. That is to say, the whole quest of the ring and War of the Ring and everything was just a means to an end, right? And that end was equipping Merry, Pippin, and Sam especially to be able to go back and kick Bill Ferny and Saruman out of the Shire. I think clearly that's not what Gandalf is suggesting here. However, I do think what Gandalf... Anyway, I do think how we're to understand Gandalf's comment there is that he's commenting on applicability, right? That the story that you have just been experiencing, Merry, Pippin, and Sam, has applicability, right? And it's up to you to find it and apply it. Again, it makes me think of the there and back again structure of the Hobbit's journey, with an S apostrophe there, the there and back again structure as a parallel to our own experience, right? They have been through this whole experience. They have been changed by their time out in the big world as they're now returning to their small world. It's not, in one sense, not quite as dramatic a shift as with Bilbo from the mundane, pretty much non-magical, non-interesting world of his life at the beginning to the world of adventure that he goes off into and then comes back to the mundane world, bringing some of the adventure with him and some of the wonders. But in the Lord of the Rings, the issue is more the big and the small, right? It's not like you're leaving the mundane world and entering the world of magic necessarily. The whole Hobbit world is tinged with magic. Certainly the world of Bag End is tinged with magic from the beginning of the Lord of the Rings in ways like it wasn't in the Hobbit, with the presence of the ring, and the sort of even just the entire legacy of Bilbo's earlier previous experience, which has clearly changed not only Frodo but the other hobbits as well. However, it's that the conversation between Merry and Pippin in the Houses of the Healings. We tooks and brandybucks. We can't live long on the heights, right? No, says Merry, but it's good for us to know about them, right? We can still be changed by them. Whether you are changed literally, as Merry and Pippin are made larger and taller by their adventures, whether you're physically made bigger or not, you will be enlarged by these experiences, and that enlargement will equip you to then handle, that it is to be applied to real world problems. And here I come back to the points I was making about applicability in the Scouring of the Shire. It is interesting in that context that this passage, the Scouring of the Shire, in which we get, I think, more overt applicability to the modern primary world, that is the way that English political issues and forebodings which have very practical and very obvious applicability to the English political situation of the 20th century in the Scouring of the Shire. I think that it's interesting that we find when they return, and it's applicability time. That applicability is something that I think that we are invited to sort of share in ourselves. Anyway, I'm moving on with increased efficiency here. One small, but prepare to have your mind blown. Mind Blown Again by Ed Powell. How many people really understand that we have all been pronouncing Gandalf wrong all these years? from Appendix E. F represents F, except at the end of words, where it is used to represent the sound of V, as in English of, Nindalv, Fladriv. There it is. V has the sound of English V, but it is not used finally. See F, that is the letter V, isn't used finally, even though the sound V might be used finally. So, Ed concludes, it's Gandalf, not Gandalf. You learn something new every day. Not that I'm going to change, by the way. Me neither, Ed. And I think in existing recordings, it doesn't sound like Tolkien himself was saying Gandalf all that clearly. First of all, I would say that I think even to be consistent with this, even to be consistent with this, we don't have to make it really pronounced. It doesn't have to be Gandalf. You don't have to sit on it that long. In fact, if you say it quickly, Gandalf doesn't sound that much different from Gandalf. When I just said it in two different ways in that one sentence. But actually, and this is another thing I want to address, Robert is asking, but, Gandalf, the word Gandalf isn't Elvish. No, but none of it, remember, he says this in Appendix E when he's explaining the pronunciation. All of the names as they are represented with English letters, remember, the whole thing is a translation, right? And he says that I'm trying to be consistent in all of it so that the pronunciation rules apply to everything. It's not, when we're reading... all of this stuff is not only translated but also transliterated. So when he is transliterating, he is trying to transliterate, he says, the sounds consistently, so that when he chooses how to spell these names in English in the book, he is choosing spellings of them that will represent the same phonemes with the same sound combinations, so that the pronunciation guide therefore applies to all words, because he's just trying to, the phonemes may be put together differently in different languages, and we can notice those patterns, but all of the phonemes are being attached to particular sounds, and he's trying to be consistent so that we can learn how to pronounce them all properly. That's what he says in Appendix E. So my understanding is that his pronunciation rules apply to all names, especially all names as they are, to all names as they are represented in English characters. What's the actual Westron for Gandalf? I don't know. No idea. But anyway, that is indeed, there's your mind-blowing fact for the day, that Gandalf is not actually Gandalf, but Gandalf. I don't think I'm going to change either, Ed, but there it is. Fascinating, huh? Okay. Michael Lucero had a Gimli question. I would like to know why you think the Valar might have let Gimli sail to Aman. I understand why the hobbits were allowed there, because they'd served the world by bearing a burden, the wounds of which couldn't be healed anywhere else. But this doesn't seem to apply to Gimli at all. Is it just because he was a member of the Fellowship? If so, should we think that if Boromir had survived the War of the Ring, he'd be allowed there too? One wouldn't think so, considering what happened the last time men set foot on Aman. If not, you're right, the whole Númenorian thing still kind of festering. But if not, then what makes that any different from Gimli? An excellent question. Of course, we don't know. It's one of those questions that, there's no answer to this. There's only that one brief reference of him sailing into the west and explaining that Galadriel put in a good word for him. Sarah King's answer is my favorite. I'm going to stand by that. Sarah says, because the Valar just wanted to irritate Feanor. That's a lovely answer, because Feanor, we're told, loved Galadriel's hair. And Tolkien even says at one point that the gold, the mixed gold and silver of Galadriel's hair, and sort of the sheen of it was one of the things that inspired Feanor to make the Silmarils in the first place. And he asked Galadriel for a strand of her hair. and she said no. She turned Feanor down. This is one reason why when Gimli asks, or doesn't ask for, but names a single strand of her hair, the other elves all gasp. That's a really cheeky thing to ask of Galadriel, especially under the circumstances when she denied Feanor himself the same request, but she gives it to Gimli. So Sarah, I absolutely love your answer. It's just to cheese off Feanor that they let Gimli in, so that he could be continually confronted by the dwarf that Galadriel, and to allow Galadriel to kind of rub it in. Hey Gimli, did you bring your crystal in which you're going to contain the 3 strands of my hair? Your little dwarven Silmarils there, Silmaril there, with the 3 thing. So yeah, you can show that to Feanor. He always wanted one of those, but he can't have one. That would be absolutely fantastic. Robert asks, was the Feanor episode composed before or after? I think the dating of those is confused. I think it's after. So that sort of added significance is kind of granted to the surprise of the moment after the fact. I believe. I'd have to double check that. But I think so. Yeah. Alyssa and Scott were both. Scott says not that Feanor is ever going to be let out of Mandos anytime soon. That doesn't mean they can't go and rub it in. No, it's certainly true, but it's still an awesome answer. The only other answer I have, which is radically inferior to that one, is simply, remember, he's in a sort of a different category. There's been no dwarf. There's no record that any dwarf ever wanted to go to the West. He's like a precedent-establishing case, so far as I know. There was that issue, of course, with humans. And humans were, after due consideration, banned from going there. Dwarves, kind of never come up before. Why should he be denied? Why can't he go and hang out with Aule, after all? But anyway, so I don't know. It's the whole. The answer to this question must be widely speculative, which is why I think I like the funny answer. But even there's a sense in which, especially in Valinor as it is now, that is after the downfall of Numenor and the removal of Valinor from the normal world, from the curved earth, how Valinor has become fairy, has become a kind of other world that the elves can go to. It's become a kind of other world. It has become another world. It's not in our world anymore. And exactly, though a straight path still remains, it is not in our world anymore. I think... Michael, I would actually quibble with your description of why the ring bearers are taken there. I don't think they're brought there as a reward for their meritorious service. Their service was doubtless meritorious, and their self-sacrifice would doubtless be honored. But I'm not sure that that's the primary reason why. One thing that has always kind of made sense to me about the ring bearers being taken over, because it's not about the fellowship, it's about the ring bearers, right? And why the ring bearers why it would be appropriate for them to go is they, as Frodo himself feels in Michael's question we were addressing earlier on, he no longer fully belongs here anymore, right? He, like Glorfindel, lives partly in this world and partly in the other world. And so he is finally brought to that other world because he's living this existence. Glorfindel is living presumably an integrated and healthy double existence in both worlds. Frodo's not. Frodo has been damaged. He's been forcibly dragged halfway into that other, or more than halfway into that other world. And he cannot be healed. He cannot be one and whole. He needs to be sort of reunited in that way. So he is, since his physical body can't be healed, he's basically taken out and made whole in the other place. Scott asks, are we to believe then that Bilbo was so damaged? Yes, I do think. He's like butter stretched over too much bread. That's not exactly a reversible condition. I mean, he starts to age when he gives up the ring, but he's still clearly affected by it. He still has been changed. So anyway, thus the situation with the ring bearers, in what is, I think, at least one way of looking at it. Dwarves, who knows with the dwarves, right? Again, you think about it, you think in the same terms. Elves belong there in Elvenhome. That place is their place as well. Humans, it's not just that they can't handle it, though they can't, it seems, and it's not just that, the Numenor thing is still a sensitive topic, but rather they can't go because it's not their place, right? It's called Elvenhome for a reason. It's not their place. Their place is elsewhere, right? Their place is beyond the circles of the world. For them to go there is wrong, is inappropriate. They cannot find their harbor there. The dwarves? Who knows about the dwarves or where their harbor is? So perhaps it is less a violation of things for the dwarves to go there. Maybe, the halls of their fathers is, Scott says Owlay has a special wing. Who knows? Maybe so. Don't know. But we just don't know all that much about the dwarves. So we don't even know how much of an exception it was necessarily. But I certainly don't think membership in the Fellowship as a whole qualifies you in any sort of for any particular reason. Merry and Pippin, for that matter, aren't going to go to Valinor either. Good. Yana, what a wonderful way to think about what happened, about the long-term effects for Bilbo. That's a perfect metaphor. Yana says, after losing the ring, the beer doesn't get less watered down, it just gets less. Exactly. Bilbo's life was like a watered-down beer barrel, right? Normally, you have only so much beer, and you tap the keg at birth, and then the beer is pouring out over the course of your life, and then sooner or later the tun is empty, and you die. That's how life works. When you have a ring of power, you continue going on. Liquid will keep pouring indefinitely out of the tap. But what's getting poured into the beer barrel is not more beer; it's water, right? So your beer is getting watered. It's your tun is still full, but it's full of increasingly watered down stuff. By the way, if you're wondering what the authority for this beer barrel metaphor of life is, my authority is Chaucer. This is the metaphor that which one was it? The Reeve. The Reeve is the one who uses the beer barrel metaphor for life. Anyway, Robert says, I guess Bilbo doesn't believe in homeopathy. No, Robert, he really doesn't seem to. Gollum had perhaps achieved homeopathic levels of humanity by the time he got to where he was. Exactly. It did not grow stronger as it was watered down, in fact, Robert. Shockingly, that didn't turn out to be the case. But anyway, so Yana's exactly right. When Bilbo loses the ring, the beer barrel stops getting watered down and carries on flowing out, right? Yeah, that is excellent. Um, yeah, yeah, I love that. That version of that metaphor. Um, okay. Hey, that was my last one. I finished. Woohoo! So I'm sure nobody else has any other questions. So we will end with the beer barrel of life. Now the beer barrel of the Return of the Ring course has come to an end here, and we have now filled our last pint at the ton of this class. However, I would like to officially announce many of you have received, that is, those of you who are voters in the Mythgard Academy process have already received notification. For those of you who are not, I will let you know that the official next class is the Unfinished Tales class. That is, it has officially been decided in a very close vote. As I told you last time, it was tied. The tiebreaker vote came in. It was very dramatic. Again, a vote for Ender's Game came in, and then a larger vote. Then a few more votes for Unfinished Tales came in after that. So, Unfinished Tales is going to be next. We're going to be reading Unfinished Tales all the way through. Some people wanted to read only the Third Age stuff. I say that's for weenies. We're going to read it all. So we're going to start at the beginning and go all the way to the end. I plan to start the first class looking at a sort of an Unfinished Tales timeline, and then we're gonna jump right into Tuor and Is Coming to Gondolin. In the first class, I will be publishing. We're planning to start class the first week of January, by which I mean Thursday, January 2nd. I'm going to stick with Thursdays, I think, because Thursdays work well for me. I will have the full schedule and all of the links and stuff published as soon as I can get to that here in the next week or two. But we're definitely going to plan to start on Thursday the 2nd. So it's going to be a 10-session class. It's going to be a longer class because the Unfinished is a lot in the Unfinished Tales. And I've tried to be sort of sensible for in how I'm breaking classes up and how much time we spend on each section and chapter, not exactly chapters, but each little portion of that book. So we're gonna go through it. We're gonna go through it cover to cover. So we will start that in the beginning of January, and that will take us through sometime in March. So thanks very much, everybody, for joining us. We've got a couple weeks off, and then we'll come back for Unfinished Tales in 2 weeks. So thanks very much, everybody. Good night.